Hi, my name's Dr. Richard Millington. I'm Programme Leader for German at the University of Chester, and I'm a historian of East Germany. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk to you about the fall of the Berlin Wall. This is a subject that I cover with my students, and it's certainly something that they always find very fascinating and interesting. Before we talk about the fall of the wall, though, I'd like to talk about why Germany was divided in the first place and why the wall was there. Because if we're going to think about why it ceased to exist, then we've got to know why the Berlin Wall was constructed in the first place. So if we think back to the 8th of May 1945, the end of the Second World War, we've just celebrated 75 years of VE Day. Germany was in ruins and there was no German government. It was part of the unconditional surrender agreement of Germany that governmental powers and sovereignty would be transferred to the four victorious allies, so to the French, the British, the Americans, and the Russians, or the Soviet Union as they were then known. And Germany was divided between these allies, so each ally was given a sector. The French, the British, and the Americans had sectors in the west and the south of Germany, and the Russians were given a sector which covered the eastern part of the country. Now, Berlin was also divided into four sectors. The particular thing about Berlin was that it found itself smack bang in the middle of the Russian sector. But Berlin was an important city, it's the capital of Germany. The Allies didn't want the Russians to have sole control of Berlin. So the western part of Berlin was divided into three sectors, given to the French, the Americans, and the British. And then the eastern part of Berlin was handed to the Russians. Now, at the end of the Second World War, there were certain plans about what to do with Germany, but these plans quickly went out of the window because of the deterioration in the relationship between the Americans, French, and British on one side and the Russians on the other side. And at the root of this deterioration was ideology. The French, the British, and the Americans supported an economic and societal system of democratic capitalism, and the Russians supported an economic and societal system of communism under dictatorship. And this ideological confrontation between these two sides is what later became known as the Cold War, the ideological struggle between communism and capitalism. Which system is better to run a country and to run a society? So, this deterioration in relations between the countries who were former allies resulted in 1949 the foundation of West Germany. The French, the British, and the Americans joined their three sectors together to create West Germany on the 23rd of May 1949. They created a Western facing democratic capitalist country. A few months later, the 7th of October 1949, the Russians founded East Germany. East Germany was a communist dictatorship under the control and influence of the Soviet Russian government in Moscow. So 1949, Germany is now divided into two countries, West and East Germany. Now, to skip forward a little bit to 1961, the 13th of August 1961, this is when the Berlin Wall was constructed. But to understand why the Berlin Wall was constructed, we've got to think about life in East Germany from 1949 to 1961. Life in East Germany in that period was hard. The economy was very poor, it was weak. The government could not supply people with enough clothing, with enough food, with enough medicine, with enough consumer products, all those things that make life nice and a little bit easier. We've got to also take into account that during this period, the government was taking brutal and ruthless measures to stamp out any political opposition to communism. So people were being arrested and thrown in prison, thrown in labour camps. Anyone who opposed the communist worldview, well, there was nothing down for you. You were headed for some sort of sticky end, I suppose you could put it. So in 19, and how the people reacted to these conditions, the living conditions and the political conditions, was, well, they voted with their feet. Between 1949 and 1961, 2.6 million people left East Germany to go to the West, to go to what they thought would be a better, happier, more free life in West Germany. Now, there were two ways in which people could leave East Germany. They could cross the border between the East and West. So this, what's known as the inner German border between the two countries. The only problem was that this was closed in 1952 and it was secured and fortified, so it was quite difficult to get across this border. It was more easy for East Germans to go to West Berlin. The border around West Berlin was not as secure. And remember, we've got West Berlin in the center of what was the Russian zone, in the center of East Germany. So what a lot of people did was they traveled to West Berlin and either stayed there because West Berlin was this island of democratic capitalism in the sea of a communist dictatorship. So they stayed there or they caught a flight from West Berlin out to West Germany. Now, the fact that so many people were leaving was a massive problem for the East German government because the majority of the people leaving were young and qualified people. So East Germany was not only losing its future generations of citizens, it was losing its doctors, it was losing its engineers, it was losing its academics, it was losing also its farmers. All these people are vital for a successful economy, for a successful country, were leaving in droves. So the East German government decided we've got to do something about this. We've got to shut the exit door that is West Berlin. So in the early months of 1961, there were rumours that the East German government might construct some sort of barrier around West Berlin. But in June 1961, the leader of East Germany, Walter Ulbricht, specifically said at a press conference, "No one has the intention of building a wall." He used those words, and those words have gone down in history because they were outright lies. A few months later, August 1961, on the night of the 12th to the 13th of August, East German soldiers and police rolled out barbed wire all the way around the border of West Berlin. Construction workers moved in and started to build a wall. Now, what were the political consequences of this? Well, the Western Allies didn't really do anything. The French, British, Americans, they didn't really react. They complained to the East German authorities, they complained to the Soviet Union, but West Berlin had always been a problem for them. Because it was in the middle of East Germany, it needed to be treated as a special case. It needed to be continually secured and fortified. It was a constant thorn in the side of the Western Allies. And well, the Berlin Wall solved that problem to an extent. And we can think about the quote or the words of President John F. Kennedy, President of the United States at the time, who said, "Well, the wall is not a pretty solution, but it's 1,000 times better than going to war over Berlin." So that's the political consequences of the Berlin Wall. The personal consequences were very serious for a lot of families. If you think about where you live today, your family might live in another part of the city. You then, if that was the case in Berlin, you might find yourself physically cut off from your family with this wall. You might never see your parents again. You might never see your brother or sister again. And this was no more the case than in Bernauer Straße in Berlin. The Berlin Wall was constructed literally down the middle of Bernauer Straße. So you might have moved to Bernauer Straße because your mum and dad, your mum and dad live opposite you. Well, after the Berlin Wall was constructed, you have now got this barrier in your way because your street has been literally divided into by the Berlin Wall. And the only way that you can get over that wall might result in you being shot dead. So they're the personal consequences of the construction of the Berlin Wall, as well as the political consequences. And it's always important to consider how this affected normal people. We can look at how it affected politicians and what they said, but what about the ordinary people? And this is something that I also am fascinated by and what we look at in my lectures, how historical events filter down and impact the lives of ordinary people at those specific points in history. So the Berlin Wall constructed in 1961. If we fast forward 28 years to 1989, the Berlin Wall fell on the evening of the 9th of November 1989. But again, we've got to consider life in East Germany in the 1980s to understand this. So life in East Germany in the 1980s was again very hard. The economy was in stagnation, it was in decline, the government was on the point of going bankrupt. And just as in the 1950s, the supply of food, the supply of clothing, the supply of medicine, the supply of consumer goods, all of those things was extremely poor because the economy was in such a bad state of affairs. There were also political problems. People were fed up with the politics of the country. People were fed up of the rigidity of the politics of the country. The East German leadership was not willing to change. The East German leadership was made up of a majority of men in their 70s and 80s who were doing things just the way that they had always done things. And people were getting really, really fed up of this. They were really fed up of the fact that they were not allowed to travel to the West, and this created a lot of unhappy people in East German society at the time. This was compounded by the fact that in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the head of the Soviet Union, and Mikhail Gorbachev introduced a program of reforms. His most famous reforms were called glasnost and perestroika. So glasnost is the Russian word for transparency or openness. He wanted to introduce more openness into the way the government operated to make it clearer to the people why certain decisions were being made. And then perestroika meant restructuring of the economy, not to change it from communism, but to make changes to make it more efficient and to improve living standards and conditions. Now, the East German government were not interested in these reforms. Kurt Hager, the chief of ideology, said in the late 1980s, in reaction to Gorbachev's reforms, if your neighbour changed their wallpaper, would you feel compelled to change your wallpaper? Now, this flippant remark really angered a lot of East Germans. They wanted reform, they wanted political change, they wanted a better form of society. And the East German government were just completely against any sort of thing that went in that direction. So this state of affairs resulted in September 1989 demonstrations starting in East Germany. First, these started a few hundred people, demonstrations for political reform and political change. But by October 1989, specifically the 9th of October 1989, 70,000 people demonstrated in Leipzig. And this was a turning point because the regime did not intervene. The security forces did not crush the protest because there were too many people. So this is a turning point, really. The 9th of October 1989, 70,000 people demonstrate in Leipzig. The people realised if we demonstrate in big enough numbers, maybe we can change things here. This did not lead to the fall of the Berlin Wall. This took place, as I said, on the evening of the 9th of November. And key to this is a press conference on the 9th of November 1989. The East German government had decided to relax some restrictions to travel to the West. They decided to introduce new visa regulations to allow people to travel to the West. And on about 7 o'clock on the 9th of November 1989, an SED minister, Günter Schabowski, was on East German television and he was announcing these visa regulations. The aim of these regulations was to placate the people a little bit, to ease the pressure on the government, to maybe stop some of the protests so that the East German government could then later regain control. So he announced these regulations, and a journalist asked him at the end of the conference, when did these take effect? And Schabowski didn't know. He'd not been briefed. He looked at the paper, and you can see this video on YouTube. He looks at his briefing notes, he looks at the back of them and says, immediately. Now, that was wrong. That was not the plan. The plan was for the regulations to be introduced the following day. This process was supposed to be orderly, it was supposed to be organised, it was supposed to be slow, it was supposed to buy the East German government time in order to retake control. The idea was give the people, or appear to give the people, what they want, and then when the people have calmed down a bit, then crush the opposition. But Schabowski got it wrong, and this news spread. It was now, Schabowski had effectively said, people can go and get a visa straight away and leave East Germany straight away. This resulted in crowds forming at the Berlin Wall. Tens of thousands of people went to the Berlin Wall and told the border guards, we've just been told we can leave immediately. We've just been told we can get a visa and we can get out of this country right now. The border guards didn't know what to do. They were phoning their superiors. They were phoning the ministries. No one was picking up the phone. This wasn't the plan. No one knew what to do. Eventually, the pressure at the Berlin Wall got so great that the Berlin Wall border guards just lifted the barriers and let people through. And these are the scenes that we see, the people streaming through the barriers, being greeted with champagne in West Berlin. Those jubilant scenes that we've all seen on history documentaries, the news, and things like that. This was important. The Berlin Wall was not just open. What it had showed the East German people was that they could force their will on the government. The people were now in control. The people had opened the Berlin Wall. No longer would the East German government impose its will on the people. The East German people could now, they had been shown they could impose their will on the government. And what happened? 11 months later, the 3rd of October 1990, Germany was reunited and East Germany existed no more, all because Günter Schabowski, that SED minister, on the evening of the 9th of November, said the wall is open immediately, all because he made a mistake. 28 years of brutality, oppression of the Berlin Wall, gone in an instant because one man said the wrong thing. So my name's Dr. Richard Millington. I'm Programme Leader for German at the University of Chester. I hope you've enjoyed my very, very short whistle-stop tour of the Berlin Wall, and please do let me know if you've got any questions. So as Programme Leader of German, I'd just like to say to you, auf Wiedersehen.